Okay, it seems as though audio is functioning. I would like to ask if Dr. Trina Armstrong could turn on her microphone as well as Dr. Christophe Ringer. Perhaps we can get started through some conversation um, and then uh, see if our video can come up. We're not quite sure what's going on here, but let's see.
Mic is on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Dr. Armstrong. Dr. Ringer, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can.
All right.
That's one step in the right direction. Oh, the beauties as well as the challenges of technology. If you could try to also click on the little camera icons, perhaps that will then give us the opportunity to see the beautiful faces that God has given you.
Something about the host has stopped my video, so I can't turn it
Yeah, same
That
thing.
is very strange. Let's see. Let's try this. Hmm. Okay. Well, it does not seem to want to be working. So I would like to take this opportunity to offer some introductions. Hello, my name is Reverend Megan A. Dean. I am the United Methodist representative, the Young Adult United Methodist representative for the Churches Uniting in Christ Young Adult Task Force. This is the third of a series that we have been working on called Tired and Torn. And tonight's webinar is all about substance abuse and addiction and mental health, particularly the racialized components of both. So while we're still trying to work out what is happening with the cameras, I would like to offer this opportunity for Dr. Christophe Ringer to introduce himself and his work.
Hi, my name is Christophe Ringer. I'm Assistant Professor of Theological Ethics and Society at Chicago Theological Seminary. And much of my work looks at issues of mass incarceration, in particular the representations of African Americans, and as it relates to drug use, and in particular kinds of images that really sustain punitive rather than therapeutic responses to issues of substance abuse.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Dr. Trina Armstrong, would you please share a bit about yourself with us?
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Trina Armstrong. I'm the Assistant Professor of Pastoral Care and Counseling and Pastoral Theology at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. And I have been doing a number of things. Primarily my work really lands in the area of trauma, but I do have a particular focus on mental health and addiction, particularly in African American life. I've done a lot of work, both doing clinical work in some LA communities, working with folks who have been addicted to various drugs, primarily crack cocaine and marijuana and some other drugs. And so I look at the ways in which trauma has manifests itself and the way in which they're calling it co-occurring disorders, but really is, for me, a direct result of racism and trauma. And that's a manifestation. That's one of the manifestations of that. And so that's how my work works around the addiction issue.
Wonderful. Thanks to both of you for being present with us this evening. I have included some instructions in the chat box that should resolve our issues with the camera situation. So please take a look at that. There goes Dr. Armstrong.
There I am.
Hello. Um,
Hello.
okay. And if you continue with the instructions that are there, then Dr. Ringer should be able to show the beautiful face that God has given him to us. Okay. So, in terms of looking at mental health in general, in terms of the racial components. Oh, something just happened. what uh, what do you feel strongly connected to in terms of your involvement, and particularly what you see happening, the trends that are happening in particularly the African American communities at the moment? Either one of you can answer that.
Dr.
Um,
Armstrong, you go ahead and then jump in. That's directly in your wheelhouse.
oh, some of the trends, I think substance abuse in the African American community is pretty prevalent and has been prevalent for a long time. As far as the racialized component of it, I think where we see it show up is the criminalization of substance abuse and the way in which that's disconnected from mental health. Um, and the way that I say that, I think about it, is substance abuse is often, um, you know, something that is mainly focused on, selling the drug, as opposed to the ways in which it has a direct effect on the person and communities in which those persons reside. I'm thinking about mainly the comparison between what I see in the media about the opioid epidemic and heroin, and how that really is largely a white drug, and the press that's getting, and not a lot. I mean, there are concerns about the lack of response to that, but I think back to the 80s with the crack epidemic, and the ways that really tore apart our communities. And for the most part, what came out of that was the criminalization of the drug, and as we know, crack versus cocaine, it's not that white folks aren't as addicted to cocaine, the white drug, as we were with crack, but just the ways that it kind of tore apart our communities and our families. And for the most part, there weren't any mental health responses to that epidemic. And I would argue that that's continuing to happen. So the focus, as I see it, is still on, trying to get folks off the corners from selling. I think the drug that's the biggest concern in our communities, it's probably marijuana at this point. And so there's really no huge responses on trying to connect drug abuse to mental health concerns in our community. And I mean, that's a really a low focus. And it's racialized as criminalization, which is a huge problem, instead of stepping back to say, how can we respond to some of the concerns in the African American community in ways that are helpful, that we're providing resources to our communities. And not that folks aren't, it's just not in mass numbers that represent the level of addiction that's happening in our communities, which is unfortunate. So that's kind of the trends. And I'm really paying attention to this opiate thing and the way that we're responding to it. And that's a concern. It humanizes white folks and their problems with the drug, but we have been dehumanized in our mental health responses. And I'll say more about that later, in connections to our reasoning for both selling those drugs and using those to numb some of the historical pain and suffering that we've been dealing with. So that's kind of how I'm seeing what's going on. Particularly as it relates to this heroin epidemic and opioid epidemic, sort of comparing what's going on in our communities to that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Armstrong. Dr. Ringer, would you like to add to that?
So one thing that's particularly disturbing about this current opioid crisis is that there is a distinction between those who have died from prescription and non-pharmaceutical opioids. And within that population, 44% of persons who have died from non-pharmaceutical fentanyl are Black or Latino. Mm-hmm. So even in this current crisis, the disparity in terms of what is happening in our communities is being racialized again. So we're seeing the same pattern that we've seen in with crack cocaine, with heroin in the 1970s, all the way back to what they used to call the cocaine crazed Negro, all the way back to the 1850s, where when whites were using drugs or abusing substances, the response was therapeutic intervention. Right? Historically, the response towards the Black community has always been punishment, discipline, and containment. In particular, also, I think one of the things that we really need to look at is oftentimes the media representations of drug related. There's still very much this association between drugs and crime. Mm-hmm. And what gets lost is that most of the death associated with drugs has to do with their distribution, their sale. It's what we call market violence, right? It's the violence associated with the sale and distribution, not necessarily violence associated with its consumption. Right? But often those get conflated in the media, and it leads to a punitive culture within our society.
Okay, wow, both very powerful responses that therefore lead to more questions, which is a good thing. So let's think about this in terms of development and in terms of just the developmental process of being human, growing up in environments in which drugs or substances are a part of the environment. How do you see what impact do you see in terms of substance abuse and addiction on families, and also in terms of how young people grow and develop and are treated, even within the education system? Dr. Armstrong, I know that you have done work with young people. Could you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I think those developmental issues are key in terms of how we think about the I would say the ways in which young people come to rely on the drug. Okay, so I did a lot of community-based work in Minneapolis, where I was teaching for about 3 years in African American communities. And many of these young people were, high school folks, some as young as, junior high school, that have already been addicted to the drug of choice. For many of them was marijuana, but there was also sort of these psychedelic type drugs that these young people are now mixing with alcohol and Red Bull and some of this other creative stuff that they're doing, ecstasy and some of these other street drugs that are real prevalent in African American communities among these young people. But I see it twofold. I see, as I think about, when I teach this course, I try to help students think about the complexity of how really addiction starts at very young ages, and that, some of the ways in which the ways in which it is the medical establishment thinks about addiction, and that it's largely sort of genetic and brain functions that draw people to the drug. But a lot of it, I think, is just socialization. It's very complex. So there's psychological, physiological, and biological reasons that, sociological too. So a lot of what I see in the community is many of their parents were also consuming these drugs, and many of these parents were also selling the drugs. So they had, they were the proximity to the drug in terms of its use and its sale. They were embedded in these communities where that was norm. And that was the way that you functioned. That was the way that you handle your problems. And so I would talk to these young people, both as I was counseling them and just being in community with them. And that's the way they really handled their problems. They would explicitly tell me, I'm just trying to numb the pain, or too much is going on in my life. And I just, and I need to be high. So I can't think about all the stuff that's going on. So they're very mindful and aware of their environments. And this is the way that they have learned to cope. Or a lot of times it's with their peers. So there's a lot of different ways that they have access to these drugs and that they become addicted to the drugs, and they don't have really any other healthy ways to deal with some of the challenges that are going on in their lives. This is what they're seeing. And so these are some of the common ways that I see developmentally that, children and teens and adults, kids are seeing it too. I mean, I would have young people tell me that they learned to drink at a very young age because, their fathers or their mothers gave them a drink, or they were in the places where all of this stuff was occurring. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's complex. There's a lot of different factors that go into the developmental ways in which they come to be. I mean, and a lot of it is, physiological as well, how the brain functions and that it continues to crave the drug. But the bottom line, if they don't have any other way to function, I remember a young woman that I was working with, that she was in a child protective services system, and had taken her kids away from her. And the only way that she could get her kids back was they had narrowed one of her problems was that she was addicted to marijuana, and that she had to go into a treatment program to, get clean in order to get her kids back, which I thought was really interesting. And so as her and I were talking about that, and she was in a group, and she basically just said, "Hey, Trina, I didn't know I was addicted. I've been smoking marijuana since I was 7 years old." Mm. So it was normal for her.
Wow.
She saw it in her families. And her kids were all now marijuana smokers. And so these are some of the things that I was seeing in the African-American community. And to help make sense of some of the complex or the intersection of these various theories that help to explain how people become addicted really from young ages. So that's how it kind of shows up in my work.
Okay. Dr. Ringer, do you have anything to add there? Your head was shaking quite a bit.
Yeah, no, I think it's powerful. I think one thing that is exasperating issues of mental health in our communities is that the police are often the first responders to a mental health crisis. And so we are really relying on police to do this job, in which really we should be thinking about whether or not there's another kind of civilian unit or body that we can develop to respond to those incidents. But also for those who are incarcerated, behavior that would normally be seen as symptomatic mm-hmm. is now interpreted as threatening, right? As violent. And so they end up receiving more punishment, right? You end up going to solitary, you end up going to another unit, another facility. And so once they're in the criminal justice system, right, it's really this compounding trauma, right? In which if they were able to get the kind of proper mental health resources, right, it has a profound effect not only on their lives, but also on the lives of their families.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Very true. So considering all of that, particularly as we're looking at the criminalization aspect of the racialization of mental health, particularly substance abuse and addiction, we want to raise this question, what is the likelihood that a person of color has had a negative encounter with the criminal justice system and is in the criminal justice system, particularly in prison? What is the likelihood that they're misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all? Or B, that they are dealing with not just the substance abuse or the addiction, but rather the addiction or the substance abuse is part of a whole. It's a symptom of a whole. So that's the first part of the question. And then the second part is, if in fact they are either not diagnosed, misdiagnosed, or not viewed as dual diagnosis, what are the opportunities within the criminal justice system for them to even receive the appropriate care? So that's a compound question. You can come from any direction you choose. I open that to whoever wishes to speak first.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it goes back to what Dr. Ringer was saying in terms of the ways in which the symptoms that present itself in addiction are oftentimes considered threatening, particularly in Black men. I think we probably saw that in the Michael Brown case. I think his autopsy revealed that he had some substances in him. that's not a reason to be shot and killed. But the way in which the reality is that substance abuse, the way they talk about it in the addiction field now is they are recognizing the combination of mental health versus addiction, and they call it co-occurring disorders, if you will, right? And always, in some ways, not integrating the two, that one affect the other, right? Because the drugs do affect, primarily, many of the drugs affect the brain and present themselves as mental health um, categories like addiction and paranoia and some of those things. And so in Black people, it makes us criminals as opposed to looking at some of the underlying reasons why, A, we're taking the drug in the first place, and that these drugs are causing some behaviors that warrant at least whoever, the police in this case, criminal justice system, to humanize us, right? They never, as far as I can see, it's always, this criminalization is huge, and it's Dr. Ringer say more about that, but it's never, I think it's still a form of dehumanization that they are not necessarily looking at ways in which, these drugs are, yes, co-occurring, but what are the underlying reasons why we're taking the drugs in the first place? It's sort of just responding to the effect that the drugs have on us, which is racialized in a lot of ways, because they definitely wouldn't do that. In terms of the work that I've seen, the responses to young Black men and even young Black women is very different than the white folks who were addicted and receiving services in the criminal justice system. I've seen it on both ends, and the way in which young Black men are treated, young Black women are treated, then young white men and women are very different. And so again, one is considered human, they need resources. The other is, they're a threat, they're angry. And these drugs do create anxiety, paranoia, anger. So they have some physiological manifestations that affect behavior. And so I just see, again, the criminalization piece is huge. And maybe Dr. Ringer, you could say more about that.
I think that's absolutely correct. And I think part of what we always have to pay attention to, especially in the realm of public policy, the way in which legislation is very often covert. Sometimes it's explicit, but in terms of how different substances are criminalized, right? So even here in Illinois, if you look at marijuana, heroin, and look at these different substances and begin to ask yourself, why is it that a certain amount triggers a certain kind of punishment, right, for one substance, and for another, it's something very different. And oftentimes it is geographic, it is racial. And so we really have to kind of pay attention to that. Also, too, we're beginning to see, we're just beginning to see police officers learning how to, I would rather it not be the police at all, but they're getting trained on how to interact with people who have mental illness or who are experiencing an episode. Oftentimes what police officers do in terms of yelling, screaming, commanding, it exasperates the problem, right? So we're just beginning to see that. We're beginning to see more use of drug courts. But what's interesting here in Chicago, I heard the Sheriff Tom Dart say that the Cook County Jail is the largest supplier of mental health services. Now, this is interesting given the number of community mental health clinics that were closed in the city. So you have to look at where are we putting resources? How can we be proactive? And I think as an active public witness, faith communities can be active in saying we need these community mental health facilities. So really being proactive on the front end.
Okay, so since you put the plug for faith communities in there, how can faith communities and even institutions that are linked to faith communities, how can the people in the pews, how can local congregations, mosques, etc., advocate for people? How can they be a part of the process of what needs to be a greater, larger scope of healing, what are some of the accessible things that can be done? What are some things that are happening maybe in your own institutions, in your own faith traditions, that are addressing these needs?
Oh man, that's a challenge. I mean, it's a challenging question. I don't see in my, I'm AME. I'm ordained in the AME church, and I don't see a lot of responses to addiction in that way. In the places where I've served, who do a good job, will incorporate programs like 12-step versions of addiction programs. They're at least acknowledging some awareness of the addiction that is in their particular communities on a holistic scale. I don't see a lot of conversation about really focusing on addiction and helping folks, because it's not necessarily addiction. For me, I see addiction as a response to systemic oppression and the way that manifests in our personal lives, in our families, in our bodies. I mean, to me, it's all connected. But I do see that, and I teach this course about every other year, and I have my students go out to 12-step meetings, various 12-step meetings, and not just focusing on drugs and alcohol, but the ways in which addiction manifests itself in other ways, food, sex. So if we include that, then it's a much larger conversation. But when we come back from those experiences, what we realize that church is happening in those 12-step meetings. And so in the absence of, and there's a ton of them. I mean, when I was in Minnesota, there was almost 1,000 12-step meetings, most of them Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. Illinois is equally, at least in the Chicagoland area, I mean, literally almost 1,000 of those groups. And so I see that, yes, there are some churches, not necessarily mine, but there are church communities that I am aware of who are responding to this in ways that they find those 12-step meetings helpful. It is a response, large scale sort of justice oriented work. In my particular context, I'm not familiar with that, but I am, as I teach this course and as I think about the subject of addiction that comes up ultimately in all of my classes, I try to help my students think holistically about how we respond to suffering and pain in general, as that being the larger focus as opposed to helping them with addiction itself, right? How are we responding to oppression and the stressors that are both born on society and that, ultimately, bleed into our lives? How are we helping people in our churches think about how to be healthier in general and heal some of the historical stuff that has happened in their life where they don't have a place to talk about it, right? And so that's kind of the way that I'm looking at it. I would hope that my denomination and some of my local churches would do a better job of that, but right now I just don't see a whole lot of that going on, unfortunately.
Dr. Ringer?
I would concur with that as well. And I think one of the challenges with the criminalization, right, of substance abuse is that even with all that has been going on with mass incarceration, with the kind of the raising of the conversation, many churches still struggle with the stigma of having a family member who is incarcerated. And so a major kind of effort in order to kind of tackle this is to kind of destigmatize within the congregation, right, those family members who are incarcerated. That's huge, because, and so what happens is that stigma of criminalization, it sets up a barrier to addressing, right, these other issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the ways in which I tend to think about this is on two fronts. One, addressing the question of shame and stigma,
Mm-hmm.
right? Kind of bringing the conversation out into the open, because I don't know any congregation that is unaffected by this.
Right.
And so we have a task, which is to kind of normalize this,
Mm-hmm.
in a sense, to say that we're all kind of in this together. Let's bring this conversation kind of out of the shadows. And one way to do that is to focus on what I call decriminalization versus legalization. One of the challenges of talking about drugs in churches is that people immediately assume that you're talking about legalization, and all of a sudden the conversation stops.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But to decriminalize, right, keeps the conversation going, right? You have to kind of navigate the piety of our congregations. The other issue, as a matter of public witness, we've talked about the kind of disparity regarding whether or not the way in which Black folks receive punishment and whites often receive treatment. This, I think, has to be presented to churches as a major theological issue. Mm-hmm. That what we're talking about is who has the capacity to be redeemed and who's worthy of redemption. Mm-hmm. And we have to say to the society that what you're saying is that we are not worthy of redemption. Mm-hmm. Right? We're not worthy of the kind of structures and support that will allow people to come back from right, the kinds of abuses of substances, as Dr. Armstrong has said, that is the product of these historical forms of oppression.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
You know, one of the things you said, particularly about the shame, it took me back to a workshop that I was doing in a local church. And so pastor had me come in and do something on trauma. And it happened to be the first of the month when traditionally pastors will celebrate anniversaries and birthdays, right? And so I was there for that. And, you know, I got up and did my thing. And as I was preparing to do my lecture/sermon, I asked, just out of curiosity, because I was mindful of the subject, who had other anniversaries that they needed to celebrate, right? It was marriage and birthdays. And one woman courageously, now this is a Black church, one woman courageously said, I think I named sobriety. And the church got real quiet, but this one woman courageously said, I have been clean for 15 years. And after, you know, the pastor and I debriefed about that, that woman had been a member of that church for years. And she was frankly shocked that this woman who she idealized as something else had been addicted to something for 15 years. But the liberation that this woman had to say, I have been clean for 15 years. And I said, okay, church, let's celebrate that. And so they did. So, you know, think of the shame and bring this stuff out in the open, that it happens and that we're doing it largely, you know, to take it out of the criminalization of it. But they also bring it in the reality that many folks in churches, right? And so how do we bring this conversation out in the open where it's not about legalization or criminalization and that we're doing it, you know? So yeah, it was really weird. It was a real moment, but she felt she had a lot of pride in sharing that moment about her life in a way that she hadn't been in that member of that church for years. So it was a moment that I'll always remember because I know that we don't talk about that stuff in the church, right? Or at least not in that church. It does happen in some churches that I've been in, but typically not in my denomination. It doesn't. So unless people talk about it as part of testimonies and those kind of things. But never as a form of education that we really need to think about this, you know, to support other folks in our communities or in our churches who may be dealing with this problem. That, oh yeah, let's celebrate brother so-and-so. And then it disappears in the atmosphere again, right?
And if I could add to that, I think part of, in addition to bringing that conversation out in the open, one of the things I experienced as a pastor was really helping finding the right people to support. In this particular case, it was to support an individual who was struggling with drug addiction, and really to sensitize them to, you know, the realities of relapse. Right? Oftentimes, you know, when a congregation gets behind someone, they put the burden on that person of being the model, right, the example, right. And I really had to say, look, if we're committed to them, right, we're going to be there, right, you know, in season, out of season. If there's a relapse, then we're there to support them.
Right. Again, doing the education, right?
Right.
Right.
That was a real kind of task, is to get them to cultivate that sensibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what would that education look like? What would cultivating a space that is um, able to manage the piety,
Mm,
but able to acknowledge the humanness and the human
mm,
struggle, what would that look like?
I'm a fan. I am such a fan of 12-step programs. I just think
mm,
that model is such a powerful model in terms of what churches can do to emulate something like that. I mean, the 12-step program really was born. The guys who created it is largely a Christian response to their own addiction as they were trying to work out their own addiction. So a lot of it is rooted in scripture. Um, and I think the ways in which it helps to humanize, it is very narrow in terms of addiction as as something that you're born with and that you're going to have to deal with for the rest of your life. And so it does kind of narrow it to that. But I think the power of it, which can be emulated in churches in terms of the education piece of it, is, recognizing, like Dr. Ringer said, there has to be some sort of education about both what the drugs do to your body, right? So bringing this into reality, substances harm us in some ways, and that they do affect our bodies. Think about all the people who have issues with liver because they're alcoholics and some of the ways that alcohol. So to be honest about the harm that these drugs do to the body. So we have to educate folk on that. And yes, the relapse, but there's also this other piece I think that's powerful with the 12-step model in terms of the humanization piece, is it really gets at, our own sort of complicity in both needing the drug and relying on our support systems to help those who are in those 12-step programs really move through, right? They think of it as a process, that this isn't something that we could just pray away, that we work on this in community. It's kind of broadening what Dr. Ringer said, that we're doing this community, and this space is an authentic space where we can be honest and open about who we are and our challenges, and that we are covenanting to support each other through this challenge. At whatever stage, some people are in further recovery than others, and who can then serve as mentors, others who are fresh into doing something with their addictions. I just think this is a powerful model. And what I like about it is this authenticity, this space to come and not be judged, and to have a support system to help you work through getting clean and being mindful of relapse, what the drugs do if it's taken out of the body, in the ways in which that craving, this is no different than people who are addicted to food. You start removing sugar, you're going to want it again. And so it's, a similar process of physiologically, what does it do when we take it away, and how do we support the possibility that, they could relapse.
mm-hmm.
And so how do we put those support systems in place and not just, to get them clean? So I think for me, that's a powerful model. And I always, I'm always grateful for churches who value that model, but not as 12 steps, but as a way of thinking about how to do church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We can be real and honest in church. And so that's what I really value about it more than the 12 steps, is that people go, the reason why folk are going to these 12 steps is that they can be real and honest, and they create relationships around that. And so what a wonderful model that could be if we were, really the church that could really consistently do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Excellent point. Dr. Ringer, did you want to add anything to that? Is there another component of what this healing space within the faith community would look like or need to be?
So we're talking about using 12 steps as a model for church. I was about to run and shout over here because I think she's absolutely right. I mean, this is, developing a church culture in which people truly can be authentic. I think one thing I would add to that also is the churches, I believe, should also learn how to be in partnership with other organizations, that, especially if you're at a smaller congregation and you might not have the resources to address some of the complexities, and you might have to partner with, for example, a housing facility, right? I mean, when I was pastoring, there were times when somebody would call me up at 1 o'clock in the morning and say, "Hey, your guy didn't come in last night." Right? So, having partnerships that can really provide additional support networks outside of Wednesday night Bible study, Sunday morning worship, right? Really kind of using the church as a catalyst to create additional layers of support for individuals, especially layers of support for people who have been or are on that journey as well.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So to flip the question, what are some examples of things that you have seen within institutions, within faith communities in particular, that are examples of what not to do, what to avoid, what is not helpful? Because there are so many folks who believe that by doing this one simple thing, or doing maybe perhaps even a complex thing, that is the answer, that, hey, we're offering you a space, we're offering this healing, but in all actuality, perhaps it was not really considering the depth of the issue at hand, of the person's hurt at hand. So are there examples of things that you have witnessed within your research, within your work, that are definitely things to avoid and to be conscious of?
Oh man, that's a tricky question on one hand, because I would say that some of the I was doing a classmate of a guy who was doing some research down in Skid Row when I was in Los Angeles working on my graduate program, and got a chance to go down there and talk to him. And this was his ministry, so he would bring a lot of this into our institution, and we would talk about it and to think about, kind of the things that he was experiencing, mostly because most of the people who were down on Skid Row were African American men. And he would talk about, was the first time I ever heard of that concept, like poverty pimps, how he pretty much named it. And we talk about the Skid Row model and the kinds of nonprofit organizations that were down there that were providing resources that, on the one hand, were great resources. One of the kinds of resources that I think is probably something that I don't consider to be helpful in terms of helping to sustain sobriety or to addiction is probably something like the Gospel Union, or some of those church-related organizations where they are really couching addiction in sin, right? And they're only focusing on helping them get off the drug because the drug is of the devil, or some other kind of theology that I don't think is very helpful. And so there's a sense of urgency in just getting them off the drug without really sort of the wraparound services. I say that on the one hand, that I don't think that that's a very healthy version, but I am aware of some people who did do this. They came to these organizations and basically became clean because of it. Because for them, that approach is you do abstinence. You just completely abstain from the drug. And hope that God is a part of that God is sustaining you through that, and that is your resources. And so that language is a little problematic. Some do relapse, because again, if you're only focusing on that, then you're not taking into account the complex ways in which that addiction is situated in the whole of their lives. And so when I talk to people who are involved in those ministries, for me, it sounds very narrow. I mean, it's very much an evangelical way of thinking about addiction and helping people through addiction. And those are the kind of organizations that are really responding to people who are homeless. And I'm not as familiar with the homeless community. I do have a student that's working down there, so I've talked to him about that community, and actually was supposed to be doing an independent study on it. And it's really these men who are coming into this organization. Many of them are addicted, and they're just really sort of placating them. It's a transitional shelter, and they preach to them with the hopes that those are the resources that's all the resources they'll need to get clean. So I just don't think that those are helpful to really get at the problem that could sustain them. To me, it's just a model that, again, that poverty pimp, when I got introduced to that level, keeps them coming back in many ways. I was like, whoa, I never really thought about it like that. So that was helpful for me to think of it that way. So that's a model that I don't think is very helpful.
Dr. Ringer.
I would agree with that. There are there are especially in terms of homelessness. It's interesting because I've seen situations where literally across the street from one another, there is a mission in which their understanding of homelessness and addiction is it is all personal. Across the street, there was a ministry which understands that people are homeless because, and they also have addictions because our social systems have failed them, right? And so it really, you can almost see how the theology kind of drives the structure of the ministry. And I would add two things I've seen that I think are troublesome. One, as it relates to transitional housing in particular, there are, I've seen a number of versions of transitional housing where the expense of it keeps them perpetually in transitional housing. It's very difficult to get out into permanent housing because of the weekly amount that they have to pay. And not being able to have permanent housing does not assist them again in whether it is their sobriety or the difficulties of reentering society, right, for those who have been incarcerated. The other issue at the level of congregations is, and we've touched on this earlier, but oftentimes in congregations you'll have someone who has a powerful testimony especially in terms of being delivered from drug addiction. And sometimes we may, although it may not be intentional, but we make that person the model, and we don't offer the kind of range of experiences and complexities. And oftentimes, if those who may be struggling, we don't offer the kind of empathy that as a congregation we need, because we say, well, hey, this person got delivered and they haven't looked back, and that becomes a frame, right? Yep. And what we do is we kind of reinscribe without necessarily saying it explicitly that there's something wrong with your faith.
Right.
You have not believed strongly enough. Right. If you had not had this kind of experience.
Right.
Wow. Okay.
And I've actually seen kind of congregations get into a kind of comparison, right, and contrast. They know someone is struggling with addiction, but they see so-and-so is in the choir, and they're saying, what? And we have to be attentive to that. Right.
That's true.
Wow, very powerful. So this goes along with the empathy piece. We have a question that came in, which I will rephrase a little bit. Given the fact that Churches Uniting in Christ is an ecumenical organization, what can primarily Anglo congregations, or just all-out white congregations, what can they do to help churches of color in terms of dealing with the racialization of mental health and substance abuse in particular? How can they partner? How can they help without undermining the experience and the efforts of churches of color?
Dr. Ringer?
Well, my initial response is that many of those congregations have mental health professionals within them that have expertise. And if there's a way to, and if there's a way to have those individuals to in some sense, as an act of public witness, to lend their expertise to this issue and to challenge the criminalization and the disparities, especially disparities in resources and how we address this question. So I would ask that they would leverage their own resources in their congregations publicly, and to actually challenge how it is that the disparities in how this question is addressed.
Yeah, I was thinking resources too, to both, apply those resources in that particular context, but also advocacy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
We can't have too many advocates, so I think that's a place where we continue to need voices who, in many ways, will speak on behalf of persons of color
Mm-hmm.
in ways that'll have more of a profound effect than maybe even folks of color will. So I
Mm-hmm.
think, yeah, those are places that I could see that would be very helpful for white congregations to respond.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is another kind of question, not exactly pertinent to the topic, but an interesting one nonetheless. Um, have either of you heard of churches uniting in Christ before you were extended an invitation to be a part of the panel for today?
No, I have not heard of Churches United in Christ.
I had not, although I was aware that there's an affiliation with the United Church of Christ. I believe I was aware of a number of their ecumenical relationships, but as far as this particular one, I was not.
Okay, thank you for answering that. Okay, back really to the topic at hand. Um, Another question is, how can young people in particularly be a part of advocacy and change, considering the fact that, and I'm kind of rephrasing as I'm reading, considering the fact that, as Dr. Armstrong mentioned, um, substance abuse can start as early as very early childhood. So, what can young people do? And I guess young people should probably be qualified as, um, the 20 somethings and younger, perhaps. Um, in what ways can they be a part of awareness and positive change?
Well, I think awareness, education is always the first step. Um, we can't, I don't think we can be advocates. I just don't believe we can be advocates unless we have education about whatever it is that we're advocating for. So that would be the first step. That's not unprecedented. I mean, I even think back to one of the earlier models of organizations that it was probably the police, or it's escaping me at the moment, but I'm just thinking of the DARE program and how prevalent that was probably in the 80s and 90s. It's since gone by the wayside, but I think of programs like that do in some ways try to include young people to be um, mentors or peers. I think that's a powerful way of including young people in the conversation about drug abuse and drug use, particularly around opiate use and some of the other psychedelic drugs that young people are using. So to become educated and to also be aware of how it affects the body, how it affects psychological thinking, all of the other ways in which it manifests in young people's lives. But I think just the education piece um, and peer mentoring is always a powerful model. Um, so to become educated on it and to be willing to go into these very communities and maybe create focus groups or support groups. I just see all kinds of opportunities for young people to really have a role in this. I mean, I just go back to this whole peer mentoring things. The reason why a lot of people oftentimes, exposure to peers who are using substances could be one way for them to get addicted. How powerful was that if we had a bunch of young people who was advocating other ways to respond to whatever life challenges they have other than using drugs? But not just saying that, but educating folks on what drugs really do. Kind of like the "this is drugs on your brain" kind of commercial back in the day.
Oh, with the skillet.
Yeah, the skillet in the egg. So I think, wow, social media, just the resources that we have now. I could just see some powerful campaigns. I'm not aware of any. I'm sure they may be one, but just think of the ways that social media can be utilized in positive ways of sharing video clips and educational things, and even little small webinars, and just ways in which that can be implemented on college campuses, where that's one of the first places where drinking emerges. Alcohol addiction. So I just see young people as really a great resource. Those are some of the ways that I think they could be involved.
Dr. Ringer.
I think on the advocacy side, I think if young people were to, as an example, the Drug Policy Alliance is a wonderful organization. Not only do there's a lot of great information, they're accessible via the internet, and they can actually give you the tools to engage in advocacy where you're at, whether it's city, state, federal, and they're constantly doing webinars, conferences. You have all the kind of latest kind of up-to-date research. So I think connecting with resources like that, it really young people can be a real force for change in their communities.
Okay, thank you for that. And considering the fact that we are the CUIC Young Adult Task Force, I think I should probably clarify that those of us who serve on the task force are not particularly 20-somethings. Young adult is defined by each member communion, but most member communions say, 40 or under, 35 or under. But the questions seem to be geared a little bit more towards the younger young adults. So here is another question, kind of diving back into the depths of the experience, particularly within either the juvenile system or just the general criminal justice system. What is the likelihood that someone who has been repeatedly before a judge for substance abuse issues, what are the chances that they will actually enter into active recovery within the system?
Well, the way that happens is really mandate. Oftentimes they're forced into programs. That's part of the kids that I were working with. A lot of them were in juvenile detention, so they were not of age yet to go into, the adult. Anyway, the adult. So for me, it just seems like even some of my adults, they were mandated to go to these programs. Even the organization that I worked for, many of the people who came in for support to get off the drugs were mandated by the court to do so. So, to really get to a place where you want to work on your addiction that's a hard first step, which is why the first step of 12-step programs is so challenging. But most folk who are part of the criminal justice system are mandated to go into recovery, to participate either in some of the ways in which they're mandated is to go to a 12-step program. Many of the men that I worked with in Los Angeles, they were mandated to come to the program, and part of the treatment protocol was that they had to go to a 12-step program. So they were forced to do this. They didn't do it on their own. It was part of the probation requirements, part of child protective services requirements, whatever ways they had, they were in the criminal justice system. So that's how I see it. I think once you get in, that's going to be one of the requirements for release or probation.
Dr. Ringer, would you like to add some final thoughts to that?
I think that's correct. In part, part of the carrot and stick, if you will, is people want to avoid parole violations, right, and being sent back to jail. I think the challenge for those who are not on probation, who what they call flatten out, sometimes they're vulnerable, right, because that mandate is not there. Especially with as it relates to issues of mental illness, sometimes they don't. Their medications change. It can be very difficult if you're just kind of on your own without a lot of social support. So it's a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mhm.
Well, I would just like to thank the both of you for being present with us this evening, despite the fickleness of technology. Thanks be to God that it ended up working. Thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts. We also would like to extend thanks to the entire CUIC Young Adult Task Force. We also want to give a shout out and a big thank you to WOMAC Consulting, as well as the Connectional Young Adult Ministry of the CME Church, all of our hosts and attendees. And for those who have attended but had to leave, a link will be provided of this webinar. A link will be provided for everyone, and you can feel free to watch it, share it. Hopefully, the comments that you made today have helped people to greater understand this issue and the complexity of it, as well as given them some inspiration as to what to do to move forward. So thank you so much. If you have any concluding benedictions, then we can be on our way.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for responding.
All
Have a
right.
good evening.
All right.
Thank
Take
you.
care. All right.